Never imagined that the worst moment of my life would happen on a Tuesday afternoon in my own kitchen while I was standing at the stove stirring a pot of chicken soup I'd made from scratch because my daughter-in-law had texted me she wasn't feeling well. That was 3 days before she told my son I was suffocating them and that either I stepped back completely or she was leaving. My son chose her. He called me that evening, his voice flat and rehearsed, like he practiced it in the car on the way home. "Mom, we need space. We think it's best if you don't come over for a while." I asked what a while meant. He said he didn't know. Then he said something that still rings in my ears at 3 in the morning. "She feels like you're always there, and honestly, Mom, so do I." I held the phone against my chest for a long time after he hung up. The soup was still on the stove. I turned off the burner and sat down on the kitchen floor, which is not something a 63-year-old woman with bad knees should do. But I didn't have the energy to make it to a chair. Let me back up. My name isn't important. What matters is that I raised my son alone for most of his life. His father, Clifton, was a good man in the early years, patient and funny, and the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down. But when our son was 9, Clifton got a job offer in Portland, and I couldn't relocate because my mother was sick and I was her only family in the state. Clifton went. We tried long distance for 14 months. We both know how that story ends. I never remarried. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because it's relevant to understanding why my son became the center of my world in a way that probably wasn't healthy for either of us. He was all I had, and I made sure he always knew he had me. I worked as a hospital administrator for 30 years. I was good at my job. I was methodical and organized and the kind of person who gets things done before anyone else realizes they need doing. I applied all of that to motherhood. When my son, who I'll call by his relationship to me because that's how I've come to think of him, when he met his wife 4 years ago, I tried. I genuinely tried. She came from money, or at least from people who spent like they had it. She wore shoes I couldn't afford on a good month and had opinions about things I'd never thought to have opinions about, like the thread count of guest towels and which neighborhoods had the right energy. She worked in marketing, which from what I could tell meant she was very good at making things look like something they weren't. The first Christmas she came to my house, she stood in my living room with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "It's so warm in here." She meant the house. The word warm was doing a lot of work that day. My son looked at her the way men look at women they're afraid to lose. I recognized it because Clifton used to look at me that way in the beginning, before Portland. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself any mother struggles with her son's partner at first. I bought her thoughtful birthday gifts. I remembered how she took her coffee. I invited them both to dinner twice a month, and I always cooked whatever she'd mentioned wanting. Once she said offhand that she'd been craving lamb, so I drove 40 minutes to a specialty butcher and spent 3 hours making a dish I'd never made before. She ate 4 bites and spent the rest of dinner talking about a restaurant in the city that made it better. My son didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't say anything. 6 months after they got engaged, they came to me with a proposal. Not a request. A proposal. They had found a house and they wanted to buy it, but the market was brutal and they were short on the down payment. Could I help? They'd pay me back within 2 years, once my son got his promotion, and they'd had time to settle in. I had $47,000 in savings. I gave them $38,000. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $38,000. Money I had set aside over decades of careful living. Money that was supposed to carry me comfortably through whatever came after retirement. I gave it to them because I told myself that's what family does. Because I wanted them to have a good start. Because my son looked so hopeful when he asked. They moved into the house that October. By November, she had redecorated the guest room so there was nowhere for me to stay when I visited. I started noticing small things after that. The way she'd check her phone when I was mid-sentence. The way my son started echoing her opinions, even ones that contradicted things he'd said to me for years. How Thanksgiving shifted from my house to our place without anyone asking. How I got a 2-hour window on Christmas morning timed carefully around her family schedule. Her family who lived 20 minutes away and saw them every weekend, but they needed something from me every few months, reliably as seasons. The roof had an unexpected issue. Could I help as part of it? My son's car needed major work and they didn't want to take on more debt. Her sister's bachelorette trip to Savannah. Would I like to contribute as a gift? I always said yes. I always found a way. The total, when I finally sat down and added it up last year, was a little over $61,000 across 3 years. Not counting groceries I brought. Not counting the times I drove an hour each way to help when she had a cold. Not counting the soup. The phone call about needing space happened 4 days after I dropped off that soup. I did what they asked. I stayed away. I didn't call more than once a week, and I kept the calls short. I watched my son's life through social media the way you watch a movie you used to be in. Photos of their kitchen renovation. A trip to Napa. A dinner party where I recognized some of our mutual friends in the background. Friends who hadn't thought to mention they'd be there. After 8 weeks of this, my son called. He sounded warmer. He said they'd like to have me for Sunday dinner. I told him I'd be there. What happened that Sunday I have turned over in my mind so many times it's worn smooth, like a stone in a river. I arrived at 2 o'clock. The house smelled like something good was cooking, and I let myself feel hopeful. I set my coat on the chair by the door, the way I always did. I walked into the kitchen to say hello. She was at the counter, and she turned around when she heard me, and her face went through something complicated before she settled on polite. "Oh," she said. "You're early." I was 2 minutes early. I know because I'd sat in my car at the end of the block for 10 minutes to make sure I wasn't imposing. My son came in from the backyard, and the 3 of us had a dinner that was technically pleasant and actually excruciating. Afterward, while my son cleared the dishes, she and I sat at the table, and she looked at me with her head tilted and said, "I want to be honest with you. I appreciate that you're trying, but I think we have fundamentally different ideas about what boundaries in a family look like." I asked her what she meant. She said that my showing up, my cooking, my helping, it was enmeshment. She'd been seeing a therapist, she said, and they talked about how my behavior was affecting her ability to build the life she and my son wanted. She wasn't unkind about it. She was worse than unkind. She was clinical. She talked about me the way you talk about a problem you're working on solving. "We really think," she said, and that "we" landed like a stone. That it would be better if we kept things more formal. Maybe dinner every couple of months. Holidays by rotation. Less spontaneous contact. My son came back in and sat down and did not look at me. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. I kept thinking about the $61,000. I kept thinking about the down payment and the roof and Savannah and the soup. I thought about 8 weeks of obedient silence, of calling once a week and keeping it short, of learning to perform smallness so they would let me back in. And then I stopped thinking about all of it. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the dark for a while, and made a decision. The next morning I called my attorney. She is a woman I've known for 15 years, precise and unruffled, the kind of person who has heard everything and is surprised by none of it. I told her the full story. She asked a few questions. Then she said, "The $38,000, did you have anything in writing?" I did. When I gave them the down payment, I had insisted on a simple written agreement. Just a page, not a formal legal document, but signed by all 3 of us. A loan with the understanding it would be repaid within 2 years. My attorney said, "Good, because 2 years was up 7 months ago." I hadn't mentioned it to my son. I kept waiting for him to bring it up. He never did. She also asked about the other amounts. The roof, the car, the various smaller contributions. Most of those had been gifts, nothing in writing. But the $38,000 was documented. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want what's mine," I told her. "And I want to stop being managed." She sent a formal letter that Thursday, a legal request for repayment of the outstanding loan with a 30-day notice. I hadn't told my son it was coming. His call came Saturday morning before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. "Mom." His voice had a quality I recognized from when he was small and had done something wrong. Not quite guilt, and not quite anger. "What is this?" I asked him to be more specific. "The letter from your attorney. The loan repayment notice. I told him it was exactly what it appeared to be. The money was a loan. The agreed time frame had passed. I was requesting repayment. Mom, we don't have that kind of money right now. You know the renovation cost more than we expected, and I let him finish. Then I said, I understand. But I provided that money as a loan in writing, which all three of us signed. The terms were clear. There was a long pause. Then quietly he said, Did she do something? Is this about Sunday? This is about $38,000 that was due 7 months ago, I said. If you need more time, we can discuss a payment schedule. But I need you to take this seriously. He said he needed to talk to her. I said I understood. We hung up. What came next? I was not entirely prepared for, even though I should have been. She called me herself. 2 hours later, her voice had dropped the clinical tone. Now she was upset, really upset, and while part of me knew I should feel something about that, mostly I felt very calm. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said. We're family. Yes, I said, which is why the loan was supposed to be repaid. You never once said anything. You never even mentioned it. I was waiting for you to bring it up, I said. The agreement was your suggestion as much as mine. You both signed it. There was a silence, and then she said something that I think she immediately knew was a mistake. This is because of Sunday. You're punishing us. I'm requesting repayment of a loan, I said. That's not punishment. That's a contract. She hung up. What I didn't know yet, what I found out 3 days later when my neighbor texted me a screenshot, was that she had posted about it. Not with my name, but with enough detail that anyone who knew us would know exactly who she was talking about. A long post about family members who weaponize financial help to maintain control, about toxic relationships and boundaries violated, about the painful reality of dealing with someone who gives with strings attached. The comments were supportive. People who didn't know me at all were calling me manipulative. Someone wrote that this was classic narcissistic behavior. I sat with that for a day. I will be honest with you, it hurt. Even when you know something isn't true, seeing strangers agree with the why still has weight to it. Then I forwarded the screenshots to my attorney. She drafted a second letter. This one was not about the loan. Meanwhile, I was hearing from other people. My son's aunt, his father's sister, called to gently ask what was going on. She had seen the post. I told her the factual sequence of events. Just the facts. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, Honey, I owe you an apology. Clifton and I both assumed for years that you were difficult. I think we owe you a long conversation. I told her I'd like that. A woman from my former church reached out. She said she'd been following the posts, and something felt wrong about the narrative. Could I share my side? I didn't. Not publicly. I just said that I had documentation and I was handling it through appropriate channels. That turned out to be enough. People who knew me, who had watched me show up for my son for 30 years, started asking questions of their own. The attorney's letter regarding the social media post arrived at their house on a Wednesday. My son called me that evening, and this time he sounded different. Not the small child voice, not the flat, rehearsed voice. He sounded tired. I didn't know about the post, he said. I want you to know that. I found out when the letter arrived. I believed him. That might seem naive, but I know my son, or at least I know the parts of him that still resemble the boy I raised, and he has never been comfortable with public confrontation. It wasn't his style. It was hers. I don't know what to do, he said. That's not my problem to solve right now, I told him. What I need from you is acknowledgement that the loan is real and that you intend to repay it. We'll figure out a payment plan, he said. I promise. I told him I'd have my attorney draw up the schedule. Then I said, I want to ask you something and I want you to actually think before you answer. He said, okay. When did I become someone you had to manage instead of someone you could talk to? He was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he finally said. It happened slowly. She and I would talk about things, and I'd get a version of events, and then that version would just become the real version. I stopped checking. Stopped checking with me, I said. Yes. I didn't say anything else about it. But I did say, I love you. I've loved you since before you were born. That's not what this is about. What this is about is that I spent $61,000 and 3 years of Sundays being made to feel like a problem, and I'm done with that. He didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't asking for one. The payment plan was formalized the following month. They began repaying the loan in installments. It was not fast and it was not easy for them. And I will admit there were moments when I almost called and said, forget it, don't worry about it. But I didn't, because I knew what would happen if I did. The money wasn't the point anymore. The point was whether I would let myself become invisible again for the sake of keeping peace that wasn't peace. What I didn't expect was what happened inside me during that time. I had been so organized around my son's life for so long that I genuinely didn't know what to do with the empty space. The first few weeks, I kept catching myself thinking I should call and check on them, or wondering if they needed anything, or feeling guilty for not having dropped off food. It was like having a habit with no object. You keep reaching for something that isn't there. I started filling the time the only way I knew how. I walked more. I called my college roommate Pauline, who had moved to Asheville years ago and always told me I should visit. I visited. I stayed for 10 days in her guest room and ate too much barbecue and laughed until I was sore and remembered who I was before I was anybody's anything. When I came back, I signed up for a watercolor class. I am not a naturally artistic person. My first 5 attempts looked like something a worried child had made. But I kept going, and around the 8th week, I made something that my instructor held up and said, "Now that's interesting." And I drove home feeling like I'd won something significant without being quite able to say what. My attorney handled the rest of it. The social media post was quietly removed. The repayment schedule was honored month by month. My son and I started talking on the phone again, awkward at first and then less so. She and I don't talk much. When we're all in the same room, which happens at the necessary family moments, we are both polite. That's the right word, not warm, not cold. Polite. It is a kind of honesty, actually, to stop pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. About 6 months after all of this, my son came to see me by himself. Not to ask for something, not prompted by any event. Just knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon with a bag of groceries and said he thought he'd make us lunch. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd stood making soup that she never thanked me for, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about any of it, not directly. We talked about his father. We talked about things that had happened when he was a kid. We talked about a novel he was reading and a podcast I'd gotten interested in. We talked the way we used to talk before. At some point he said, "I know I got some things badly wrong." I said, "I know you did too." He said, "I'm still working on it." I told him I was still working on things too. That much was true. I'm not going to tell you it's fully repaired. What was broken between us? It isn't, not yet, but something is being built in its place that feels more honest than what came before. And I think that matters more in the end than the original thing. The original thing was built on my pretending I had no needs and him forgetting to check. What I know now is this. You can love someone completely and still require them to treat you with basic dignity. Those two things are not in conflict. For most of my life, I believed they were. That love meant absorbing whatever came at you without complaint. That asking for respect was the same as being difficult. I was wrong. And it took losing $61,000 and 8 weeks of mandatory silence and a bowl of soup that nobody thanked me for to understand it. The watercolor class wrapped up in spring. My instructor asked if I wanted to continue in the advanced session. I signed up before I walked out the door. On the way home, I called Pauline and told her I was thinking about coming back to Asheville in the fall. She said she'd already made space in her guest room just in case. I laughed all the way home. When I pulled into my driveway, the light was going golden the way it does in late afternoon, and I sat in the car for a minute just looking at the house. My house. Paid for by my own 30 years of work, full of my things, my books, my coffee mugs, the chair that's been in the living room since before my son was born. I didn't give everything away. $61,000 went. Yes, some years went. Some of myself went, for a while. But I got something back that I hadn't realized I'd put down somewhere. My own sense of what I was worth, not to anyone else, not measured in what I could provide. Just the plain fact of who I am. It turned out that was what I'd been holding on to in that kitchen on the floor with my bad knees the night he said he needed space. Not grief, exactly. More like something waiting to be reclaimed. I reclaimed it.